Yep, that has been raised as they're predisposed to diagnosis, and also the diagnostic categories were developed outside of this country, and they weren't always able to take into account, I guess, cultural variables. And when you talk to people that have been in the sector for a long time, misdiagnosis seemed to have been rife in some instances, where cultural nuances were unfortunately interpreted as signs of a mental disorder. So a whole range of international factors as well. We note during the 1970s that New Zealand I guess the economy was in a fairly depressed state. And Māori and Pacific Island people tended to suffer more from the economic decline. And urbanisation was also blamed to a certain degree. All very, and actually it's a useful introduction into the next slide, and that while we're all sort of fairly aware of the problems with Māori mental health or Māori mental illness in a contemporary sense, the first examination that I can find into Māori mental health was actually designed to find out why the rates were so low within the Māori population, matua. So why the rates were so low? It's a quote from a guy called Ernest Beagle-Hold, 1947. The fact that there are fewer neurotic and psychotic illness among Māori than among Pākehā in New Zealand emphasises, amongst other things, the tremendous value to the Māori of possessing a psychological security that comes from tribal and family security. So is there any anthropologists in the audience? Good, I'll fire away. So the anthropologist will sit at the back of the room and observe people. And he was trying to find out, now, why are these Maoris so mentally stable? And this is the hypothesis he came up with, and there's other quotes too. Kind of prophetic quote here: judging from experience in other parts of the world, we may hazard a guess that increasing adjustment of Māori to the Pākehā way of life with its standards and values, morality and behaviour will bring a tendency for the Māori mental disease figures to approximate more and more to those of the Pākehā population. So with respect to this, I guess, a conversation on the relationship between culture and mental health and well-being, this is an early example of an anthropologist, an academic in the 1940s, talking about the relationship between culture and cultural values and how it provided a protective mechanism in terms of mental health and well-being. However, there was a warning that as the Māori population, potentially, he was speculating at this stage, that as it became more urbanised and these cultural foundations were eroded, it's probably not going to be too good for the mental health and well-being of the Indigenous population. Quite a prophetic comment in that it seems to be that he was right. Remember, this was in the 1940s. Which time have we, I'm trying to drag the presentation out a bit so that we won't have time for questions at the end. Just wait, I'll send a text message or something and get someone to call. It raises two questions, and I don't know if I have the answer, but has Western culture caused Māori mental ill health? Well, no. In a nutshell. Has it contributed? Well, possibly. But Māori mental health is far too complex for it to be, I guess, attributed to any one issue. And we know that some Māori are doing quite well in Western society. So I don't think Western culture has caused Māori mental ill health. I think what has caused it partly is the breakdown of these cultural practices for health and well-being. It's actually okay when they're broken down, but it's when they aren't replaced by anything positive that's the real issue. The second question Will a return to ancient traditions and values solve contemporary mental health concerns? Again, probably not. However, culture can fundamentally play a very significant role, I believe anyway, in promoting mental health and well-being. However, culture, and again I believe, needs to be placed within a contemporary context and in a way that's meaningful to the population in modern times. How that's done, I don't know. But some people, particularly those involved in the provision of mental health care to Māori, have, I guess, done a very good job at exploring ways in which culture can contribute to mental health and well-being. And of course, and going back to some of those earlier slides and pictures, unfortunately, some people have, I guess, left their traditional culture behind and adopted other cultures which aren't always good for mental health. Gang culture would be one example, I suspect. Drug culture would be another culture. So leaving behind one culture for another doesn't necessarily mean a positive outcome, depending on what the culture is. And as I said, there is a possible application of traditional concepts and cultural practices to modern times. And I think that might be the key, how they applied to modern times. So my final slide here, implications for mental health in Aotearoa in New Zealand. If we look at my earlier definition of culture, a set of shared attitudes, values, goals and practices that characterise a group. Well, I guess there's an opportunity there if we can promote a culture where mental unwellness is not tolerated within our country, within our nation. When the shared attitudes, values, goals and practices of our society are able to promote mental health and well-being. And lastly, when we have a culture of tolerance and acceptance, and when that's promoted and cultivated, it's going to require, and this is high-level blue skies thinking, but it's going to require, I guess, a cultural shift within our society if we want to take advantage of culture as a mechanism to promote mental health and well-being. Some people think it can't be done. However, we've seen cultural change occur in this country time and time again on a number of issues, and it can happen quite quickly. There was an outcry when people were forbidden to smoke in bars. They said it'll never work, it's part of our culture. Smoking's part of our culture. In the space of 3, 4, 5 years, if you walk into a pub and someone's smoking in there, you think they're smoking cannabis. People are so shocked. There's a culture attached to wearing a seatbelt. There's a culture, although it's not always adopted by everyone, culture attached to not drinking and driving. So if we can apply culture in a way that's embedded within our society and in ways which promote mental health and well-being, I think that's another strategy that we can adopt, I guess, in order to promote mental health and well-being. It's going to be a challenge though. I think it's my final slide. But thank you for listening. No time for questions?
Plenty of time for questions. Questions?